fighting for equal rights in education. The early years, exclusion and extreme racism, 1850s to 1905. Late in 1847, San Francisco's town council erected a one-room schoolhouse on the town plaza, now Portsmouth Square. The school was under public control, but it wasn't free. It required tuition fees. The school opened in April 1848 with one teacher. However, when he learned that gold had been discovered, he went to seek his fortune mining gold. School was out. The beginning of San Francisco public schools. In October 1849, John Pelton opened a school in the First Baptist Church in San Francisco. In 1850, the city council passed an ordinance making it a free public school, the first in California. In 1851, a city ordinance provided for a city board of education and a city superintendent of schools. There were no Chinese children in the earliest days of California. Most of the Chinese immigrants were men who had come to Gold Mountain to look for gold in the 1850s. More men came to work on the Transcontinental Railroad that was finished in 1869. They came hoping to send money back to their families and to return to China someday. Others came to start businesses and for farming or fishing. The beginning of Chinese exclusion. California became a hostile environment for Chinese workers in the 1860s to 1880s. For protection, many Chinese men settled together in Chinatown, San Francisco, or in other cities of California. Chinatown offered them more security and a safer place for businesses to grow. By 1870, the Chinese population of San Francisco was about 8% of the total population of approximately 150,000. 1/4 of all Chinese in California now lived in San Francisco. Where were the women and families? Some wealthier businessmen could afford to bring their wives and children, but that was difficult as exclusion laws were put into place. California tried to restrict Chinese immigration as early as 1858, and it got worse. In 1870, the U.S. Congress approved the Naturalization Act, which barred Chinese from becoming U.S. citizens. The act also limited immigration of Chinese women even if they had husbands in the United States. Chinese men had to show evidence in support of a woman's moral character before their wives could be admitted. Those who wrote the law said they were trying to stop human trafficking and prostitutes from coming to California, but the intent was clearly to reduce the growth of the Chinese population and encourage Chinese men to go back to China. Just to be sure, in 1875, Congress passed the Page Act, which barred immigration to Chinese, Japanese, and Mongolian prostitutes, felons, and contract laborers. Then, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by the U.S. Congress. Most Chinese laborers were excluded, but merchants, diplomats, scholars, and some others were still allowed entry. And so, Chinatown became largely a bachelor society, a place where men were separated from their wives back in China, and men were prevented from finding a wife here. By 1890, only about 4% of all the Chinese in America were women. By 1890, there were few children and few families in Chinatown because of those laws. But there was a slowly growing number. According to the Morning Call newspaper, November 15, 1896, they seemed to spring up like mushrooms overnight. Let's look at some early photographs of children in Chinatown taken by RdAlngJ, 1890s to 1905. How were they educated? Children of wealthy families probably had private tutors at that time. Older children, especially boys, would be sent back to China for more schooling. Many children couldn't go to school at all because they had to work. Some had to work long hours with no pay, almost like slaves or indentured servants. Some worked as house servants in the homes of the wealthy. Because of bad economic conditions in parts of China, some parents would sell or be tricked into selling their children, especially girls, into servitude or into forced marriages or even prostitution. Some young women were kidnapped and smuggled into the United States as part of human trafficking. While slavery had ended in the United States after the Civil War, not everyone enjoyed freedom. Could Chinese children go to public schools? In 1859, 30 Chinese parents petitioned the San Francisco Board of Education to open a primary school for their children. When the Reverend William Spear offered a basement room in his Chinese Presbyterian Mission Church on Stockton Street between Clay and Washington, the board agreed to open the Chinese school. It lasted just 4 months and closed for lack of funds. For the next decade, the school was reopened several times and each time soon shut down. San Francisco segregated Chinese school children from 1859 until 1871. Then the city refused to pay for any more classes for them. Chinese public schools were closed. Why couldn't Chinese children go to other public schools outside of Chinatown? Racial segregation. The city overwhelmingly rejected integrated schools. Let us keep our public schools free from the intrusion of the inferior races, a newspaper opined. If we are compelled to have Negroes and Chinamen among us, it is better, of course, that they should be educated, but teach them separately to keep our Caucasian blood pure. And from California State Superintendent of Schools, Andrew Mulder's annual report, 1858, when he threatened to withhold public money from any district that permits the admission of the inferior races, African, Mongolian, or Indian, into the common schools. Today, we call this racist thinking white nationalism. It has a long history in the United States. Segregated public school for Chinese, opened, closed. In 1870, the new California school law stated that only blacks and Indians would be educated in separate schools. The law said nothing about Chinese. The San Francisco Superintendent of Schools, James Denman, who had closed the Chinese school a decade earlier, now had the legal right to close it for good. Denman did so on March 1st, 1871, saying that its average daily attendance of just 20 students was too low. At the same time, he refused to allow any Chinese students to go to white schools. There is a middle school in San Francisco named after James Denman. Some people think that name should be changed. Do you agree? The Chinese community argued that it was grossly unfair. They had to pay taxes, but were denied the right to send their children to public schools. But the San Francisco Board of Supervisors said in a report, "Guard well the doors of our public schools, that they do not enter. For however hard and stern such a doctrine may sound, it is but the enforcement of the law of self-preservation to prove that we can justly and practically defend ourselves from this invasion of Mongol barbarianism." It took an 8-year-old girl named Mamie Tape to force the city and state to provide schools for Chinese, even though they were segregated ones. A challenge to a San Francisco educational policy went to the California Supreme Court. Tate versus Hurley, 1885, and a segregated Chinese school in San Francisco. Mamie Tate was born in San Francisco. She and both of her parents spoke English. She lived outside of Chinatown and had white friends in her neighborhood. And she wanted to go to school, but there were no public schools for Chinese students. In 1884, her parents, Joseph and Mary Tate, tried to enroll Mamie in the all-white Spring Valley School, then on Broadway Street near Polk Street. The school's principal, Miss Hurley, as ordered by the school board, refused to admit Mamie. The Tapes sued the school district in a court case known as Tate versus Hurley, and they won. The San Francisco School District had to provide her with an education. However, the fight for her rights to a public school education was not over. The San Francisco School Board appealed the lower court's decision to the California Supreme Court, where the justices sustained the verdict of the lower court. That means the higher court agreed with the lower court's decision. The court said that Chinese students had the right to a public education, just like Native Americans and African Americans. However, the school districts could provide separate but equal schools to those groups. Still no victory for Mamie. The San Francisco School Board had rushed through the California legislature a law authorizing separate schools for Chinese students. Then they quickly opened up a new Chinese school in Chinatown. They still refused to let Mamie into Spring Valley School. Mrs. Tate wrote a furious letter to the superintendent. May you never be persecuted like the way you have persecuted little Mamie Tate. Is it a disgrace to be born a Chinese? Didn't God make us all? What right have you to bar my children out of the school because she is of Chinese descent? Mamie Tate will never attend any of the Chinese schools of your making. Never! I will let the world see, sir, what justice there is when it is governed by the race-prejudiced men. Just because she is descendant of Chinese parents, I guess she is more of American than a good many of you that is going to prevent her being educated. While Mamie couldn't get into Spring Valley Primary School, her court case brought about the right to public school education for other Chinese students. However, it was segregated. Soon the Chinese primary school was opened at 916 Clay Street near Stockton Street. Mamie and her brother attended the school. The Tate versus Hurley decision guaranteed the right of children born to Chinese parents to a public education. Students would be taught by white teachers and learn the same subjects taught at other public schools: arithmetic, reading, spelling, grammar. Church schools were also part of Chinatown's early history. Church schools were important when the public schools were closed to Chinese students. The Presbyterian Church opened in 1853. 6 years later, it was the initial site for Chinatown's first neighborhood Chinese school. State law segregated primary schools, leaving Chinatown residents to petition the city for years before getting space of their own. The Occidental Mission Home for Girls, the home as it was known then, is called Cameron House today. Leaders of the mission, Miss Culbertson and later Miss Donaldina Cameron, offered thousands of Chinese girls an escape from indentured servitude and human trafficking. Although Miss Cameron's life was threatened, she continued rescuing and educating the girls victimized by violence and abuse. She is credited with helping 3,000 girls escape brutal enslavement. Education at the missions included religious and domestic training, as well as traditional schooling. In the mission home, the children typically rose at 6 o'clock a.m. and dressed for breakfast by 6:30 a.m. Mission home life consisted of daily routines of singing and prayers, lessons in English, and domestic chores such as washing, sewing, cooking, and cleaning. Missionaries also attempted to provide education in Chinese language and history to foster an understanding of the children's own native culture. Chinese schools offered Chinese language classes after English school. Many Chinese children attended Chinese school after English school or on weekends. Parents wanted their children to be bilingual so they could participate in both English and Chinese situations. Part 2. A Time of Segregation and Racism, 1906 to 1950s. A Chinese school was built in 1886, and students had an opportunity to get a free public education. However, in 1906, there was an earthquake and fire that destroyed much of San Francisco and all of Chinatown. Other things had happened too. In 1911, the Qing dynasty rulers were overthrown and a new Republic of China was established. And with the change, Chinese men no longer had to wear a queue or pigtail. Most Chinese men in San Francisco cut their queues and no longer wore long robes, but put on Western-style suits and pants. In 1918, the Spanish flu pandemic caused up to 100 million deaths worldwide, including an estimated 675,000 deaths in the United States. It is very similar to today's COVID-19 pandemic. When Chinatown was being rebuilt, a new school had to be built. It was on Clay Street, and it was larger than the first public Chinese school. This Chinese school was later called the Oriental School, and it was opened for Chinese, Korean, and Japanese students from all Asian backgrounds. Separate but equal. Segregation showed the continued anti-Chinese attitudes. The San Francisco Board of Education spent considerably less on the education of Chinese children. Whereas the average cost of education around 1916 was about $31 per white student, the Board of Education spent only $25 per student in the Oriental School. In addition, Chinese children were in larger classes with 51 students per teacher, compared to an average 41 students per teacher in white public schools. The school building was not as good. Students at the Oriental Public School are saluting the flag. How many students were there in Chinatown in 1896? Students in the Oriental Public School, 85 students. Students in church mission schools, 135 students. Students in afternoon Chinese schools, 52. How many students were there in Chinatown in 1920? Students in the Oriental Public School estimated more than 900 students. Because of overcrowding, students went to a half-day schedule for a while. Students in secondary schools, junior and senior high school, went to integrated public schools only if white parents didn't object. Students in church mission schools, 434 students. The majority were in kindergarten or first grade. Many would later transfer into the public school. In addition, 9 Protestant night schools opened for men and boys who worked during the day. 301 students. 5 mission schools also offered Chinese language classes. Students in afternoon Chinese schools, unknown, but estimated more than 200. The Oriental School was clearly too small. In 1924, a small wooden annex building was built across the street from the Oriental School because of crowding. At the same time, a new school was built on Washington Street. It was called Commodore Stockton Elementary School. Today, it is called Gordon J. Lau Elementary School, 950 Clay Street. Built in 1924, this is the Washington Street entrance of the Commodore Stockton Elementary School. In 1929, the enrollment was 1,500 students in grades 1 through 8. Shortly after it was built, it was already overcrowded. Chinese students needed another school. There was another small but important change at the school in 1924. Miss Alice Fong was hired to work at Commodore Stockton School. She was the first Chinese American and first Chinese bilingual public school teacher in California. Today in San Francisco, there is a bilingual school named after her for her service to the community. Other pioneering Chinese teachers were Miss Catherine Chan, who taught kindergarten at Commodore Stockton from 1928 until 1952, and Mr. Sui Ing, who taught at Commodore Stockton 1930 to 1939, then at Francisco Junior High 1939 to 1947. A gradual end of segregated schools. Little by little, things were getting better. Some Chinese students were admitted into integrated schools claiming to be Japanese. Japanese students were not excluded from public schools, and some principals let them enroll if no white parents complained. Because there were no Chinese high schools or junior high schools, Chinese were allowed to enroll. It was cheaper to integrate than to build more Chinese schools. Chinese Americans still experience racism, but people who were extreme racists were seen as un-American. Francisco Junior High School, now Francisco Middle School. In 1925, seventh graders from Commodore Stockton School were transferred to the new Francisco Junior High School because of overcrowded conditions. Soon, white parents complained. They threatened to withdraw their children from their neighborhood school. They said this was an Italian-American neighborhood. The debate went on for months. Should a new junior high school be built in Chinatown for the Chinese students? But where? How much would that cost? In 1925, Francisco's enrollment was 1,100 students, and only 190 were Chinese. All the students got along well. The Chinese students were doing well. Why should the school district re-segregate the school? Dr. Frank Fisher, a respected teacher of 30 years and now at Francisco Junior High School, spoke up. He supported admitting Chinese students. Not allowing them would be illegal, un-American, unfair, and unjust, and he pointed out the many advantages to be gained by Oriental children by their association with other races in the school. He gathered a petition from more than 400 white parents saying to let the Chinese students stay. Dr. Ing Pun Chiu, editor of the Chinese language daily newspaper Zhongsai Yatbo, spoke about how China and the United States had fought side by side in World War I. He said how prejudice can only exist when Chinese and other students are not allowed to go to school together. His presentation was greeted with applause. After months of debate, it was decided that Francisco Junior High School would stay integrated. And so, many schools that had been segregated began to open their doors to Chinese students. As Chinese families moved into new neighborhoods, And as civil rights laws increased, integration of public schools increased. White parents had fewer complaints. Racism still existed and still does, but much progress had been made. Segregated schools were not allowed after 1954 when a little African American girl, Linda Brown, tried to go to a nearby white school. She was denied and went to court. That was just like Mamie Tate about 70 years earlier. In 1954, the Supreme Court of the United States, in the Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas case, stated that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal and therefore violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. All across the United States, states were ordered to desegregate their schools. And in 1971, the San Francisco School District was integrated as a result of a federal court decree. Now, all San Francisco schools had to be integrated. Thurgood Marshall was a lawyer who argued this case. He later became a justice on the Supreme Court of the United States. Part 3. Modern Period, 1965 to today. New challenges, new opportunities, a new activism. Changes in immigration. With the end of the Chinese Exclusion Act and changes in immigration laws, many more Chinese could come to the United States, and the San Francisco School District was not prepared. Support for limited English speakers. With the new Immigration and Nationality Act, 1965, thousands of Chinese families came to settle in San Francisco. The enrollment jumped dramatically in 1968 to 1972. With the flood of newcomers, most schools were unprepared. The new students were eager to learn, but schools had to find classroom space, textbooks, and qualified teachers. Community groups helped the newcomers too. They organized after-school programs for tutoring and recreation. Health programs were expanded. Community activists pushed for more housing for a crowded Chinatown. Teachers became activists. Teachers and students were frustrated by empty promises by the school district to provide more Chinese American teachers, counselors, classrooms, and curriculum materials. In 1969, a group of Chinese teachers formed the Association of Chinese Teachers, or TACT. They organized and supported a variety of projects that would help Chinese students: teacher training in teaching Chinese language and culture, curriculum development in the history of Chinese in America, fundraising for scholarships for Chinese students, and advocacy for bilingual education and newcomer education. Lau versus Nichols, 1974, educational support for limited English speakers. Approximately 2,800 students of Chinese ancestry in the school system did not speak English. 1,000 of these students received supplemental courses in English language, extra classes, and help. And 1,800 did not receive such instruction. They did not speak English. Kenny Lau, a third-grade student at Gene Parker Elementary School, was one of those students. A class action lawsuit against the San Francisco School District was brought by the non-English-speaking Chinese students who did not receive additional instruction. The students alleged that they were not provided with equal educational opportunities and therefore were not being afforded their 14th Amendment rights. The Supreme Court unanimously decided that the lack of supplemental language instruction in public schools for students with limited English proficiency violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The school district was required to provide students with appropriate relief. But what was appropriate relief? In San Francisco, it meant hiring more bilingual teachers and counselors. an increase in teacher training and curriculum development in English as a second language, ESL, and bilingual instruction, and materials to teach students about their history and culture. It also meant more space. Bilingual programs, bilingual schools, extra help. Once, students were told not to speak their home languages and to only speak English. But today, most parents agree that it's important to know 2 or more languages. In San Francisco, you can do that. But getting those classes took activism by educators and community members. But important questions about education were not only in the elementary, middle, and high schools. Teachers and students in the universities tried to make important changes there too. Activism on university campuses. In 1968, students at San Francisco State University demanded changes in the curriculum. They wanted courses about history of all ethnic groups, not just white people's history. They demanded ethnic studies courses, Black and Asian and Pacific Islander American history, support for third world students, and more faculty of color. The students went on strike. Students protested, and some were arrested and went to jail to stand up for their beliefs. The university was shut down. The strike lasted 4 months, the longest strike in university history. At last, the university agreed to offer ethnic studies classes and hire more faculty of color. Remembering the past, planning for the future. As we have seen, the Chinese community has been active in fighting for equal rights in education for over 160 years. On the side of the City College of San Francisco's building in Chinatown, we again see the image of the fish dealer's daughter. Next, we see a saying about education and struggle. Diligence is the path up the mountain of knowledge. Hard work is the boat across the endless sea of learning. What does this saying mean to you? Part 4. Japan and the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907. In 1906, the San Francisco School Board assigned the city's Japanese students to the Oriental School where Chinese students had already been segregated. Most Japanese families lived outside of Chinatown, and going to a school with mostly Chinese students in a poor, crowded wooden building was not what they wanted. Japan was a rising military power, and its diplomats lobbied President Theodore Roosevelt to intervene. Roosevelt called the San Francisco mayor and school board to Washington and negotiated a compromise. Roosevelt knew that San Francisco and the Asiatic Exclusion League were concerned with the increased Japanese immigration. Japanese immigrants to San Francisco had experienced the same racial discrimination as the Chinese. San Francisco's former mayor Phelan, from 1897 to 1902, was active in the movement to restrict Japanese and Chinese immigration to the United States. Phelan campaigned for United States Senator on an anti-Japanese platform and won, serving from 1915 to 1921. In the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement, the United States agreed to accept the presence of Japanese immigrants already residing here, to permit the immigration of wives, children, and parents, and to avoid legal discrimination against Japanese American children in California schools. In exchange, Japanese would restrict immigration to the United States. This diplomatic understanding between the United States and Japan became known as the Gentlemen's Agreement. While prohibiting the immigration of new Japanese laborers, the Gentlemen's Agreement did allow those Japanese already in the United States to bring their parents, wives, and children into the country. Many Japanese and Korean women used this provision to immigrate to the United States as picture brides, marrying immigrant Japanese men they knew only through an exchange of photographs. Such arranged marriages helped Japanese immigrant families grow. Many settled in San Francisco's Western Addition, where Japantown is today, and in the south of Market area. Their children attended integrated schools as part of the gentleman's agreement. From Angel Island Immigration Station, most Japanese immigrants were admitted within a day or two. This was the shortest stay among the Asian immigrant groups. After 1907, an estimated 10,000 picture brides came to join their Japanese husbands in America. Still fearful of a growing Asian menace, the United States nativists effectively cut off all Japanese immigration with the Immigration Act of 1924. And sadly, in 1942, many families with young children were sent to detention camps by order of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's distant cousin. During World War II, an estimated 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals or citizens residing in the United States were forcibly interned in 10 different camps across the United States from 1942 to 1946. Today, in San Francisco schools, Japanese language and cultural programs are offered from elementary to high school.